So we are learning about human population. We studied in our part 1 this week with the human population ecology. We look at historical data all the way back to the Stone Age. We learned that the human population really started to increase around 1830 with the Industrial Revolution. At that time, with the Industrial Revolution, we actually had access to better food, better nutrition, better healthcare. And also you had a lot of scientific advancement that were done at that time, and that gave us access to new technologies that could find direct applications in our societies. We learned that not all countries develop at the same pace. Some countries, like Sweden, are among the most advanced countries today. They have access to all the resources that they need. They have access to all the technologies that they need. And as a result, their population is very stable today. Other countries have developed much slower, what we call the developing countries. Their population are still growing. And then in those countries, typically the economical development is also behind. So people do not have access to the resource and technology that they need. We also learned that for a country to achieve stability in its population, the population has to go through 4 phases. The first phase, when you have high birth rate and high death rate, the population is very small, and the population is made mostly of very young people. In phase 2, thanks to advancement in healthcare, the death rate starts to decrease. The birth rate still remains high. Countries in phase 2 still have a very large population. The population starts to increase, and the population is still very young. In phase 3, both the birth rate and the death rate decrease. This is also the result of access to better healthcare and also education. You start seeing more older people in those populations, so the population is still increasing, but not as fast as in phase 2. And then in phase 4, both the birth rate and the death rate are very small, or are very low. The population is said to be stabilized. That means that the proportion of young individuals is about equivalent to the proportion of older individuals. So for a country to go from phase 1 to phase 4, people must have access to healthcare and education in that country. And this process is what we call the population transition. In the second part, we are going to discuss the population transition. How do we obtain population transition? So we are going to talk about population development, and you will see that population development is to be looked at together with the economic development. Population development is defined as how human population change over time in terms of size, structure, and distribution. So this encompasses studying the growth, stability, and sometimes even decline of the population. What is the age structure of that population? So demographer works with the pyramid of ages. They also look at the fertility and mortality rate. What is the status of migration? How many people move into those populations? How many people leave the population? And then what is the status of urbanization? Where do people live? Those 5 elements are tightly connected to economic development. So for example, here we have the population of Thailand between 1960 and about 2014. Thailand fertility dropped drastically. In 2014, on average, women had 1.6 children. And at the same time, the gross national product, the GNP per capita, what a country produced, increased And so did the life expectancy. So what does this mean is that between 1970 and 2014, families on average became smaller. More adults were able to work. So that means that women were able to work. Less children needed to be cared for. Therefore, overall, you had more income for families. Older adults became less dependent on their children because they built up their own wealth. And they also release the need for that dependence from their own children. So people could live longer, have healthier life, and rely less on the next generation. So Thailand really saw a change in its population between 1970 and 2015. It is projected to stabilize very, very soon. Thailand is still facing a lot of issues with pollution and diversity loss, but overall, this country has been transitioning from phase 2 to pretty much phase 4 in about 40 years. So democratic transition, when you go from high birth rate and death rates, and then you go all the way down to low birth rate and death rate, this does not happen fast. It's not a fast process. It took quite some time for industrialized country to get to that point. Today, we know that not all the nations are at the same phase of development. Some countries are in phase 1, we are moving them to phase 2, and then other countries have already reached phase 4. The countries that are still in phase 1, maybe 2 and 3, those countries want first economic development. They want to have a way of life that is comparable to high-income nations like Thailand now, South Korea, or maybe even Brazil. Those are countries who really want to reach their level of life like more advanced developed countries. So the developed nation that successfully raised advancement in the phase to stabilize their population have avoided what we call the poverty population trap. So we're going to define what that is in just a minute. In the developing world, government know that they need to reduce fertility. However, most of the healthcare efforts, are focusing on decreasing mortality before decreasing fertility. So there are two theories on what the developing country could do. Either increase their economic development, and then this will somewhat slow down the population growth, or they can focus on policies that will help with family planning to try to slow down the birth rate. So those efforts to lower fertility rate, very, very quickly, it was understood in the United Nations that in order to reduce poverty, you need to reduce fertility rate. And so in 1974, you had the first real discussion about how this can be done. Back then, the United States thought that family planning was probably the best option. And then in 1984, about 10 years later, other methods were proposed. Whatever choice nation were doing, really the idea was to reduce the fertility rates. And then in 1994, during the International Conference on Population and Development, really, it was really understood that there is a strong connection between economic development and lowering fertility. So by improving women's rights, access to healthcare and education in jobs, this is really central to reducing population. So no matter what kind of approach government choose, if they can focus on women's rights, education, and access to jobs, then you will have improvement in economic development. In 1914, in Stockholm, another conference took place, and that conference really stated the foundation for improving the lives of women and girls, improving access to reproductive services, and improving health and education for all. A document was published, and it really stated the rights for population, the right to develop, and the human rights for everyone. So controlling fertility is really the key to demographic transition. We know that high fertility and poverty are linked together. In the early phases, where you have low-income economies, we also know that you have a very, very large population, a very large number of children per woman. Differences in fertility rates between similar countries are due to difference in social supports. So why do poor families continue to have children if it's so challenging? Children definitely can hamper effort to get ahead economically for families, for women especially. It's very hard to work and have a very large number of children, especially when they are very small. And then for the children, when you are in challenge economically, you may not have access to very good healthcare, and so they may not even be able to survive to adulthood. So why do we still see a very high fertility rates in developing countries? This is because children can bring income to the families. In many developing countries, they're actually an economic asset. Children will start working very young. Women will marry typically for example, in Uganda, before they are 18 of age, and they have on average about 6 kids. Those children can help bringing income to the family. They do work, and it helps with the family. But when you work very young, you don't have time for education. Another example is Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, young people are facing challenges such as war, poverty, lack of human rights, lack of access to education, and this makes for a very uncertain future. Girls are affected more than boys. They marry very young, sometimes to men that are much older than them. They typically bear children immediately after being married, and then they die quite young. So those girls have almost no access to school, and then they don't have access to contraceptive. However, there has been significant effort that have been for young Afghan women, girls and women. Fertility is starting to go down, and then the use of contraceptive is accepted a little bit better now. So in poor nation, poverty explains why those families still continue to have a high number of children. Parents want security when they get old. How do you get access to food and healthcare, even if it's very limited, if you're not able to work anymore? So you're going to rely on your children. A lot of the young children die very, very early. So in order to make sure that they will have some children that can survive up to adulthood, those parents make sure that they have enough children. Children start working very young, and so they are basically helping hands, bringing incomes to the family. A woman, her status typically increase when you have more children, so you need to consider cultural and maybe even religious factors in that big picture. And then access to contraceptives is often unavailable or it's too expensive. So women continue to have children. So this is what we call the poverty trap. It's like a cycle. you will have high fertility rates in developing nations because of poverty, and that poverty, don't have a high fertility rate, maintain poverty because people do not have access to education. They need to work very young. As a result, the population will grow very fast, and then this will actually accentuate inequalities. So what can you do to have smaller families? So one thing that we need to realize is that before the Industrial Revolution, the developed countries, the countries that are developed today, resemble very much the countries that are still developing today. Pre-industrialized agrarian families had many, many kids. And then with the industrialization and urbanization and the development of better healthcare and better access to food, this lead to smaller family. So children are going to be educated. This has a cost. In order to anticipate the need of older people, you need to have maybe a pension system and a social security system. Women started to join the workforce and become more financially independent. You have access to contraceptive, and typically in developed countries, it's pretty cheap to have access to those contraceptive. You have access to healthcare and better healthcare. And then you have a lot of different educational opportunities. And people are also getting married a little bit later. So all of those factors together makes that the fertility rate is lowering. So what can be done to reduce the fertility rate? So economic development alone will not work. You also have to have policies in place. You need to put in place a security system for people that are getting older. And the security system should be built up by the people themselves. They should not rely on their children. You should invest in healthcare to reduce lower infant and child mortality so that women have less children. Giving access to education to all the children is also something that is very important to educate your population. Once you have a good education, that will give more job opportunities, especially for women. And then giving access or permitting access to contraceptive and education about reproduction is also part of the services that should be offered to women. So countries with such public policies have moved through the demographic transition. So once a country is starting to undergo the demographic transition, that country will also be facing the demographic dividend. So when the working age population increase relative to the younger and older members of the population, the country or the government for this country will have to take a decision. Are you going to invest in health, in education, or in economic opportunities? So in order to make a decision, government are looking at the dependency ratio. So how much do the non-worker, the people under the age of 15 and over 65, rely on the population of workers? And then are you going to spend a little bit less on school? This is what we call the demographic dividend, increasing a little bit less in education, but increasing in opportunities, in job opportunities. So this can work in reducing poverty and increasing the economic growth of the country. However, this should only be done for maybe a few decades, 2-3 decades, until the number of older people increase. Once the population of the proportion of older people increase, you need to invest again into education. So we are going to see why in part B.